Anybody here get to see, I know several of you did because I saw you there, get to see the bridge over here at Rocheport explode and fall into the river? How many of you got to see that? Yeah, well, so yeah, but you got to watch it. So Everett was just describing like the scene of watching the bridge. It just, how it was amazing, just all in one piece. It just fell straight down. It didn't go cockeye or anything. It just like boom, went down. Um, so that morning I had a friend who was staying on the river. So Roger and Barbara over here have their stern wheeler on the river, and they had camped out the night before, and my friend Anthony was going to borrow their little boat and zip down and pick me up at the Catfish Katie's boat ramp so I could hang out with them and watch this bridge fall in the river. Well, it turns out the river's totally socked in fog, and there were dozens and dozens and dozens of boats being put in at Catfish Katie's and at Taylor's Landing, all going full bore through the fog. It was absolutely nutty. And so Anthony called and he's like, yeah, that's not happening. And so I knew my buddy Roger Helmka was putting his boat in at Catfish Katie's. So I went and I found him, and it was still dark at this time. And so I actually snuck ahead past the highway patrol guys and like parked my truck off in the weeds. And then I'm walking down to the boat ramp, and there's this guy standing over to the side, and he has a flashlight and he's shining it at his thumb in the dark. And like, I kind of didn't quite catch what was going on, but basically he was trying to hitch a ride on a boat. So he was showing us his thumb in the dark. And at one point I was probably looking like goofy and lost and confused as always. And he kind of shouts out to me. He's like, are you Steve? And I was like, yeah. And I just assumed like, I know this person. I don't know who they are, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, well, I just know you because I've watched the Big Money Speaker series on YouTube, and like I've seen your face and stuff like that. And he's like, I'm trying to get in a boat on the river. Do you think I could get in a boat? And I'm like, well, I know my friend Roger has a boat. Let's go see if he has room. So we went down there, and Roger was getting in his boat, and he had room. So Matt Fetterly over here hopped on the boat with us, and then Roger zipped us through the fog. I had my MR340 paddler app to make sure that we didn't run into any wing dikes. And I was telling Rog, we didn't run into any other boats or buoys or anything, thank God. And then we got up there, we waited for the fog to clear, and there was 55 boats, if I remember right, all like hanging out in that same area below the bridge to watch the bridge go in. What? They wouldn't let you closer than 1,000 feet. So the highway patrol had a couple of boats stationed, keeping people back, and everyone was very respectful about it. No one wants a bridge falling on them either, right? So then Roger's boat starts overheating. We're just like sitting there idling, and his boat starts overheating. So we had to go to the side and tie up, but we still had a really great view. And that's when I got to meet our presenter tonight, Matt Fetterly, and he starts telling me, oh, he's works for Boone County Historical Society. And then we start talking river history and like realizing like that we know things that no one else knows. And so then we're like, do you know about this? And do you know that, and have you read this? And like, that was super fun, right? And so then by the end of the day, I was like, do you want to do a presentation at the Big Money Speaker Series? He's like, I thought you'd never ask. So, yeah, like go to the river and meet people, and good things happen, like that's cool. But a cool thing is a little, in addition to being an actual professional historian working for Boone County Historical Society, he has a side interest as well in the Missouri rivers. So Matt agreed to put together a presentation about some of the interesting stories, even going way back, about the Missouri River Valley here in Boone County. So I know that you guys are excited as I am to hear what Matt has come up with, because this is such a great crowd, So, Matt?
Okay. All right. Try it again. Test, test. 1, 2. Test, test. Hello, hello. Should have you. Check, check. 1, 2. Check. Hello, hello. Yeah. Check, check. You can hear. I can't hear myself. Am I coming through okay? Yeah. Okay. Great. As a test. 1, 2.
Testing.
Testing. Hello. Okay. Everybody here is okay now. I'm so happy to be here. I've watched these, as Steve said, on YouTube. I think I've only been here once in person for one before, but I was greatly admired everybody you've had on, and especially the scientists and the historians. There's no venue like this for this kind of information if you're interested in the river. So it's a great honor to be. My topic today is Boone County and the river in kind of the broadest sense possible. I'm going to talk a lot about history, but I want to start off with a little natural history because for me as a local historian, this is the context I really always want kind of as background. And I feel like we rarely have time to talk about it. And the relationship between humans and the land they live on, whether that's an indigenous person or a white person that settled much later, the land dictates so much of how the person behaves and what the person does and the choices the person makes. So I'm going to do a real quick primer with some deep history, some geology, and some natural history that I'm sure some of you in the room know better than I, but I think it helps us out. It gives us context as historians to literally know what we're standing on when we talk about a place. So as far as the Missouri River goes here in Boone County, famously, we have this limestone, this white limestone that we're setting on top of right now, the Mississippian limestone. And that was laid down hundreds of millions of years ago in the sea, in the ocean. And of course, it's the calcium from the shells of sea creatures that makes that limestone so bright and so shiny as you see it on the Montauk Bluffs. Fast forward real quick. I'm just going chronologically here. That limestone is laid down on top of, igneous bedrock, which is way down, way deep down, hundreds and hundreds of feet. And those beds are very deep, deeper than what you see here, the 200 feet of the Montauk Bluffs that goes down much farther. You fast forward to more recent history, the last 100 million years, and you get waves of glaciation that come over Missouri, right? And a lot of times when people talk about it, they act like it was just one big ice sheet that came and went, but it was, of course, a periodic thing that happened time and time again. And the course of the present day Missouri River is really dictated by not the last glaciation down here, but the Nebraska and the Illinois glaciations, which were a lot older. The glaciers we talk about that form the Great Lakes were like Wisconsin glaciation, the most recent one, to my understanding, which was like ended in the last cycle 10,000 years ago. That's so important to Boone County because Boone County is so unique in that Columbia itself sits right on the line, of course, between the northern prairies, which are flat, and then the more rugged Ozarks. But the really interesting thing, I think, about Boone County is that we have an entrenched river. And so much of Columbia's topography and what's around Columbia, Rockbridge State Park, stuff like that, is created ultimately really because of the Missouri River. And that's because the creeks that flow through Boone County, the waterways, incised down into that limestone over time as the Missouri River lowered. A lot of places, creeks get incised, canyons get made like that because mountains were being uplifted, but not so here. Here we had what's sometimes called a penny plain, which is really, if you look at, this is a topographical map. I don't know how well you can see that of Boone County. Everything originally before the river was formed was essentially this red level, a high level. The plain up by Ashland or the 2 Mile Prairie was probably around where it was at. And it's the river that cut down into that, and the process of the river cutting down to it incised the Hinkson Creek, the Perchie Creek, the Grindstone Creek into these valleys that are pretty dramatic as you go through Columbia. Because of the elevation difference between up where Columbia is and down here at the river, we had all this karst form, right? And when we say karst, we mean caves, springs. I know I'm preaching to the choir here environmentally, but this is the kind of context I want for local history that makes it more interesting when we talk about how humans relate later. And then ultimately, the melting ice sheet is what gave us the Loess Hills, right? Loess is a German word. We're on a Loess Hill right now. Loess is that fine silt that comes from the river. During the Ice Age, the most recent one, when the summers happened and the summers were warm, the ice up north on the ice sheets was melting. And that melting, just massive amounts of water came down this river. That's why this valley is as wide as it is. You sometimes hear people who study these things say that the Missouri River Valley is oversized for the size of the river that it's in, or that maybe the Missouri River seems like a smaller. How did it carve such a huge, dramatic valley? Well, the not historical, but the prehistorical amounts of water that were coming down were just so much greater. And in the summer, it was flooded, so plants couldn't grow. And then what would happen is winter would happen, and you'd have, bluff to bluff silt. And the wind would pick up this silt, blow it up on the hills we set on, and that's what forms these sort of dune-like on top of the Burlington limestone, so close to the river. You don't have that loess out up by Centralia. It just doesn't really exist. It only exists by the river. And that loess is incredibly important because it doesn't really recharge. We're not in an ice age right now. There aren't vast silt plains down there blowing more loess. So as humans have settled and deforested the land here, it's eroded, and it's not something that returns quickly over time. So just something to note. The next thing that kind of happens, because we're going to talk first about Indigenous people, which goes 10,000, possibly more years in this area, is the interplay of forest and prairie, as we know over time, and that we sit on that line once again. And the forest, of course, in times that were wetter, geologic timescales here, not geologic, but natural timescales here, thousands of years, times that were wetter, more forest, times that were drier, less forest. And those forests were really, tied to where there were water sources. So the Missouri River, was likely always pretty much forested around here, but when it dried, it would really just be the valley. And as the environment got wetter, it would expand up. And in the historical period, of course, we know that it expanded all the way up to like where Columbia is now, and that was pretty much forested. But you go too much beyond Columbia towards, Paris Road up to Centralia, and that area up there is very much prairie. And when European settlers showed up here, that was not not forested land. So I know we're used to thinking of the river as changing over time, but the natural environments over long periods changed over time too. And then, of course, we have indigenous land management and resource use, which happened when they showed up here. The first resource use that we have big archaeological record for is possibly, and this is very hypothetical still, the extinction of megafauna. We're talking, the woolly mammoth, large mammals that were being hunted. This is a big debate right now, to my understanding, is that a lot of times on this earth, when humans have expanded into an environment, these megafauna go extinct. So as I talk about indigenous things, I don't want to fall into the trap of, indigenous people did live in a much more balanced way with their environment than we do now, but that doesn't mean they were immune to over extracting their resources. We can talk about the great civilizations we call Cahokia now, and probably one of the most plausible theories for the decline of that civilization was over extraction of resources, over farming the floodplain, deforesting the surrounding area. So when Europeans showed up here, the indigenous were engaged in a form of land management that was basically controlled burns. There were natural fires that maintained and kept the prairies open. There were also a lot of human set fires that kept an open understory in our oak hickory forest that allowed for easy movement. The idea that it was environment, when Joliet and Marquette came down the river is not really exactly right. Humans had been interacting with this environment for thousands of years at that point. These last three bullet points are interesting. We have indigenous land management, European exploration, and American settlement. Those really indicate three different modes of interacting with nature here in Boone County. European exploration was French exploration largely here. They weren't here to stay permanently necessarily, but they were here to hunt, as we all know, furs, beaver, otter. These things were already getting scarce when Americans showed up here because, as we know, St. Louis, made its fame on resource extraction and basically shipping furs over the entire Missouri River Valley down to St. Louis. So the final type, American settlement, of course, is very different. They came here to stay. They deforested the land. Dramatic change. The most dramatic change happened with that. So really three different ways of relating there. So many of you probably know this already, but I wanted to give us that context because it's so often missing when we talk about history and local history. Two examples of the things I was talking about that impact us so much today in Columbia. You can really see the best example of these entrenched and incised meanders in Boone County in what is the Grindstone Nature Area and the east side of Columbia. We're talking Grindstone Creek, Hinkson Creek. Those are like that because of the Missouri River. Because the Missouri River lowered so much over time, those creeks lowered and continued to wash out soil, limestone, and rock down into the valley. You can even see, I don't know how close you can see, but there are old loops up in the bluff when the creek was much higher. Stevens Lake Park is an old loop of the Hinkson, believe it or not. The Hinkson, a long time ago, would have run up near Boone Hospital until it found a faster, shorter way down. And even today, there's a spot, if you're familiar with Grindstone Nature in Columbia, where the Hinkson Creek and Grindstone Creek come very close to one another. And over another 1,000 years or so, probably, the Grindstone will be pirated into the Hinkson and cut off even shorter. So this over here, you may recognize, this is a LiDAR image. LiDAR, of course, being light lasers to precisely indicate the elevation of the ground. This is the Pierpont Plain. Essentially what you're looking at are all the tiny little holes that drain into Devil's Icebox. The city of Pierpont, south of Columbia, sits on that, but you don't get this Pierpont Plain without the creek lowering, and you don't get the creek lowering without the Missouri River lowering. So if you like the Devil's Icebox, ultimately you really get to blame the Missouri River, which is kind of cool, I think. One last aside there, we talk about karst a lot, and I think we sometimes we don't mention how important limestone needs acid to dissolve. And where does that acid come from? It actually comes from largely our oak trees, our oak hickory forests. And if you've ever put a bunch of acorns in a bucket and let them set with water, that turns into some pretty brutal stuff after time. And it's the rainwater that has soaked into the ground, absorbed oak leaves, wood, acorns, and stuff like that goes into the carbonate limestone from the seashells. That's what dissolves and creates the karst. So anyway, some natural history context that I think is really fun and interesting. Let's move on to the indigenous presence in Boone County. So we really have pretty good evidence for 13,000 years of occupation or so here in Boone County. Now, there's a huge debate right now among archaeologists and anthropologists in North America over Clovis or pre-Clovis. Maybe you've heard some of this stuff. It's my opinion, and I should disclose, I'm an amateur archaeologist and an amateur geologist. The only thing I really am is a historian, is that it really seems like we were getting better and better evidence to indicate that humans were present even longer, maybe 20,000 years. There are sites in Missouri. There's a site on the Sac River in western Missouri called the Big Eddy site, which has some pretty good evidence that's been widely debated. And those times so remote, you have two problems. Stuff doesn't preserve over that long a time. And then human population densities were probably so low density back then. It's not like they were leaving a lot of trace anyway. So establishing evidence for that is really hard. But if we want to be safe, we can safely say 13,000 years of human presence in basically what is now Boone County. I think we found artifacts in Boone County from every period of Missouri archaeology that's recognized currently. Boone doesn't get really interesting, though, until the late Woodland period, which is relatively recent. That's about 500 AD to about 10,050 AD, depending on who you ask. And around here, this is kind of right before the Mississippian period in indigenous history. The Mississippian period is when Cahokia rose, when the Kansas City Hopewell rose, when you had these big, much more socially complex civilizations, for lack of a better word. But before that, here in Boone County, you had a bit of a focus. And it was first kind of discovered and acknowledged. He's kind of called the father of Missouri archaeology. Back in the 1930s, started to do some archaeology on our mounds here in Boone County. And that was when he invented the phrase, the Boone phase, named after Boone County, which is a late woodland phase, a cultural. Now, there's been, I think, some more recent debate on whether, archaeologists get very technical. Is that a real thing or not? Are we seeing things that aren't there? But it seems clear that in prehistory, the most dense human habitation in Boone County in the archaeological record was really this late woodland period. Now, what happened to those people? Did they go live in Cahokia in the city of St. Louis? Possibly. That's always a theory. Did they move on? We don't really know. But during that period, there seems to be a bit of a flourishing here. This is when a lot of our mounds were built, our burial mounds. And our mounds in Boone County are burial mounds almost exclusively. We don't have what you might think of as platform mounds where there were structures on top of. There's really no evidence for that. The old historians used to call them mounds of the spectral class, which I really like. And these mounds were generally built in view of their villages, which were usually along waterways. So really, it's no different than what we do today. Columbia is built along a waterway, the Flat Branch, and from downtown Columbia, the cemetery is up on a hill right within sight. It's pretty much the same human emotions, at play there, I think. You want to honor your ancestors. You want them nearby. You want to be able to go visit the spot. I think the same things were at play here. I should say Boone County has more documented Indian mounds, and I use the word Indian with reservation. We all know what we're talking about. A lot of American Indians identify that way. The Museum of the American Indian is the name of the Smithsonian Museum. So just understand that when I say indigenous, native, or Indian, I'm talking about these things. In the historical record, you time and time again see them called Indian mounds, of course. But these indigenous in the other Missouri, part of that's because of these bluffs I think we're on here. I think, and then this is a bit of speculation on my part, but there was clearly an association. A lot of these mountains are along our bluffs here between the symbolism of the setting sun. You stand here at Les Bourgeois, you watch the sunset in the west. It's a pretty dramatic statement, and to cultures that were very aware of the sun, very aware of astronomical cycles, the symbolism of burying a burial ground with a view of the setting sun, you know, the sun representing the end of one period, is really attractive. I should say there may be a selection bias here in Boone County because we have had probably more archaeologists and more people interested in archaeology combing over the county than anywhere else in Missouri, by virtue of the University of Missouri. That's father of archaeology in Missouri was here. So there's what scientists call a selection bias, just because we're more interested in looking at that kind of thing. Hop, skip, and a jump forward in time. Now we're into the historical period where we have the best documentation for the Osage and the Missouri nations. I put they both have languages that still exist today, and I'm not going to butcher it by trying to pronounce it, but I put their native words for their own nations there. Believe it or not, the Osage actually have a whole alphabet that they use as well, I believe. So it's pretty cool stuff. The Osage and the Missouri really are indigenous people that were in Missouri sometime before Europeans arrived here. I'm going to differentiate a little between those nations and the Sac and the Fox, who were really pushed into Missouri from the east. You know, they lived around the Great Lakes originally. They were pushed as European settlement expanded across the continent, pushed into Missouri. And this led to competition, not only with Europeans, but with the Missouri and the Osage tribe. The real final blow on the Missouri village that you may be familiar with in Van Meter State Park was the Sac and the Fox tribe coming down and making war. So it's interesting, you know, as an aside, white historians are very eager to blame the Sac and the Fox for exterminating the Missouri while ignoring their own role in competing and ignoring the Missouri. So, you know, it's all a filter. History is constructed, as they say. That painting there is a George Catlin painting of an Osage gathering. I think that would be done about 1860. So we have a lot of cool paintings of Osage Nation people. They were often described as the tallest race in North America. And reportedly, like a majority of them were over 6 feet tall, which is kind of unheard of for the time. I mean, this is a time when I think the average height of a European is hovering around a little over 5 feet. So it must have been quite a sight. This is a rendering of the pictographs that are above Torbit Spring, just a little bit north of here or south of here, along the Missouri River, along the Katy Trail. The interesting thing to me is that you get cultural continuity between some of the symbols here and what we know of the spiritual and religious systems that popped up in Cahokia later, which have been termed the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex now, which really is sort of the religious and spiritual system that's generally related across the entire Southeastern United States. But a lot of the thinking is, you know, is that diffused or spread from Cahokia? We don't really know, but it's related to that. And that we have evidence of that here in Boone County at Torbit Spring is interesting. Now, the interesting thing to me is we have these pictographs were maintained well into the historical period. And so they were renewed probably. They were drawn with ochre, which is, you know, a red mineral on the bluff side. And And they're not the only ones in Boone County. I think these are the only ones that people often know about, but we have record of many others. This is one of my favorite references. I'm just going to read it out loud so everybody can hear it. This is from William Switzler's 1882 book, The History of Boone County. So now these are his words, not mine. So this is his view at the time. He's describing a cave that's not near the river, but as evidence of other um, remains in Boone County. I want to note this quote. He says, the entrance to the cave is from the west. To the right and directly in front, there is a perpendicular wall rising above the cave to the height of 40 or 50 feet. The wall is very smooth in places and was formerly covered with rude pictures of animals and birds of all sorts and sizes, being somewhat similar in outline and finish to those found on the river bluff below Rocheport. Now stop here for a second. When he says rude here, he means to his eye, crude or unartistic is what he means. It doesn't mean offensive in any other way. So that's just kind of an old Victorian phrase. He says these pictographs are now indistinct. The cutting away of the timber above has changed the whole face of nature. The turf and the moss and loose rocks that form the awning above have fallen away, allowing the rains to beat up on the walls below until scarcely a trace of the pictures remain. Which is largely what's happened to these last remaining pictographs. These no longer exist whatsoever. He can barely see them in 1882. And I suspect that if we could rewind time and go explore Boone County in the 1750s, that we would find lots of sites like this, often in association with a cool natural feature. Torbit Spring, of course, and those pictographs have a cave directly below it, and there's quite a flow of water that issues from below that. Here we have a cave. And there are other associations. In West Columbia, there's a new neighborhood off Scott Boulevard where they have preserved a late woodland burial mound. And so I went to check out this burial mound. Lovely. It's preserved. Love it. And I notice, there's a karst plain right here. There's a bunch of sinkholes. And sure enough, right below the burial mound is a spring. And so you get this relationship between notable natural sites and places where humans wanted to be, symbolic places where humans wanted to be, whether there was something seen as a spiritual power, religious power there in their conception, or whether it was just seen as a place to get nice, clean water. I think we can speculate on, but a lot of these things might have been going on in tandem with one another. We get other clues to Indigenous history, local Indigenous history, in surviving place names. We like to joke in Missouri that our place names are so weird because you have Anglo people mispronouncing French words who were mispronouncing Algonquin words, which adds up to some pretty interesting things. The Missouri River is the first one that comes to mind, and topical, of course, named after the nation that lived along its banks a little farther upstream here. But that nation, the Missouri, spoke a Siouan language, which was the language of the plains, basically. The word Missouri is an Algonquin word, which is an Eastern word. So what the French did is they came down the Mississippi. We're talking Joliet, back in the day, and they said, "What's that river name?" And the Algonquins said, "That's the Missouri River." So that's how you get essentially these are nations that were living in Illinois, and we inherit the name Missouri River, even though that's not what the Missouri called themselves necessarily. And I'm sure you've all heard the etymology of Missouri, which famously is said to mean, people of the big canoe, or, tribe of the big canoe, which is, I think, still pretty fitting for the state today, giving all of the float trips. We have other place names, Montauk Creek and Montauk Bluffs, also Algonquin words. Montauk Creek down in Rocheport, and the Montauk Bluffs here that we stand on top of right now, which run all the way down to about Huntsdale. And I've spelled it two different ways there because there's really no agreed upon spelling. And you'll see this word Montauk all throughout the sort of Midwest, basically, and up into Canada. Montauk, best the linguist can tell, the best equivalent for us is Great Spirit, or maybe in a Christian sense, God, sort of an overarching life force, might be another way to put it. So, it's when you say Montauk Bluffs, it's not that much different than a farmer down the bottom saying those are God's hills. It's kind of the same linguistic mechanism naming those hills. The Bonfim Creek, this is my favorite one. Bonfim is French for good woman. Now, why good woman? The story goes, and this is apocryphal legend, that a Frenchman, probably a trader, was injured, and a good woman who lived along the creek banks healed him. And I read in our old books that the Osage would call a healer or a spiritual leader, which were usually the same things, a good woman, a shaman woman, a woman who had knowledge of medicine, of plants, and who had the virtue to use them to help. If you were sick, you might go see a good woman. So she's said to live along the banks of Bonfim Creek, named after her. And Bonfim Creek will come back here in the future here. Another one, Rocheport and Perchie Creek. This one, we don't actually have direct evidence that this wasn't a native place name, but it is, to my mind, not unusual at all. The indigenous people named things just like the first Europeans through here in plain English, for lack of a better word. Perchie Creek, famously, Rocheport is French for pierced rock. And indeed, there is a natural arch, which was right at the mouth of Perchie Creek at the time of European settlement. So the creek takes its name from that Rocheport arch. But the French, who could communicate with the natives, may very well have just translated a local place name into the French, which has, stayed with us. We have not changed that one into English, which is pretty cool. This last one on the list is a trick. Lovers' leaps exist all over this nation. There is a Lovers' Leap in Colombia. It's very old. It was a popular place for tryst back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It's probably somewhere around where between where Reactor Field in Columbia is and all the way to Grindstone Nature Area, perhaps Cape and Park. But that legend, this is made up time and time again, where, the Victorians kind of got romantic about it, and you get a legend of a native maiden who threw herself off the cliff because she was not allowed to marry. And this is really just there's no historical basis for this. This is hogwash. That is not an indigenous place name. There's a Lover's Leap in Troy, Missouri, by Quiver River State Park. There's Lover's Leaps across the nation. So you can't just take it as an indigenous place name because there's a legend about it. It really takes, I think, some trust of the linguist and people who study etymology to really determine, is there any validity to this place? So those are fun to explore. There's others as well all around Boone County. Back to Bonfim Creek, we have a record of this Battle of Bonfim Creek that's recounted in a pamphlet that was published in 1861. This is like incredibly obscure. When William Switzer writes his book about 20 years later in 1880 about the history of Boone County, he even says, I can't verify if this is true or not. I've included it here because we don't have any record of interaction really between, much interaction between white settlers and the indigenous population, or how that went down. I think a lot of things were probably done that people weren't proud of, and things weren't written down. In this case, I think he probably was proud of this, and it was written down because it was published kind of in his posthumous This Is My Life book. So I'm going to read this account, and then we can unpack it a little bit. But this occurred not long after one of the treaties that expatriated indigenous people from this area. So he says, not long after this treaty was made, some hunters went down to the Bonfim Creek to find some game. And in traveling down an Indian path in pursuit of game, they discovered the head of a white man sticking upon a pole. They became alarmed, immediately went back and reported what they had seen. The whites collected together as quick as possible, made arrangements to catch the murderers, and started off to where the head was found. On arriving at the spot, they found 2 men had been killed, which exasperated them very much. They then entered into a compact that they would hunt from day to day until they found the murderers and seek revenge by taking the lives of those who committed the atrocious deed. They started and traveled over a considerable scope of country and at length saw an Indian alone. They took him prisoner and interrogated him in regard to the murder of the two men, but he stoutly denied any knowledge of the murder at all. They then asked him if he knew of any Indians, and he replied that he did, and they were stationed on the point between the creek and the Missouri River. The white men immediately set out to march against the Indians. They proceeded to get as close as possible unobserved, and then they succeeded. They crossed over the creek noiselessly as possible and formed a line that extended from the creek to the river, where they came upon the Indians and found them playing bandy. They made a rush and got between them and their guns. The Indians knew now that their only chance for safety would be either to swim Bonfim Creek or the Missouri River, but the whites were too fast for them. They made a charge and killed off all the Indians, 49 in number, except one, who escaped with a broken arm. After the battle was over, the whites took the Indian prisoner upon the bottom or low ground on the Missouri River and told him that if he wished to save his life, he could do so by outrunning any one man in the company. The Indians readily accepted to this proposition and started off at full speed. But a man named Fugate started after him, caught him immediately, and led him back to the company. The whites then told him that they would give him another chance, that he might commence running, and after he got a certain distance from them, they were to commence firing, and if none of the balls struck, he could go unharmed. The Indian started at full speed again. After he got to the required distance, he ran at an angular direction, but the poor creature did not get far until he fell dead with 7 bullet holes in him. The defeat of the Indians settled the war with them for some time. So this is the grain of salt story. It could be based in fact, could have been exaggerated, or could have happened more or less as described right there. I think, though, the sentiment is kind of correct. There was not a lot of love lost between American settlers and the indigenous remnants in this area, which were largely Sac and Fox people and other passing tribes. This really contrasts greatly with how the French interacted, of course, with indigenous people, which I kind of want to unpack chronologically here, starting with this painting by George Caleb Bingham, one of my favorites. You probably know George Caleb Bingham, the Missouri artist. He lived and worked in Columbia a bit, but he also had a home famously in Arrow Rock, Missouri, and a little bit in Booneville before typically he made it big time and went to the coast. But he really became known, of course, for his close association with depicting scenes of the Missouri River. And this is one of his most famous, fur traders descending the Missouri, which is pretty cool. I mean, it's a beautiful image. He really captures the water. But I'd like to unpack the original title of it, which is a little strange today, which is Frenchman and Half-Breed Son, which is interesting. When this was presented, I think, is it the American Association of Art in New York? He gave that title, and it was too scandalous for the time, so the title was changed. But it really does capture a true sort of intercultural relationship, which was the marriage of French men to indigenous women, and the intermixture between French people and indigenous people, which in Canada really resulted in a whole ethnic group that still exists today, the Métis ethnic group. There's not a ton of that surviving around here necessarily. There's certainly some, no doubt. But this is a great depiction. There's also a great debate about whether or not that's a cat or a bear. This has raged for decades. So I think right now everybody's leaning towards bear, a bear cub, because the bear cub was seen to have some symbolic value in indigenous culture. He's also a little chunky for a cat, if you ask me, but it's hard to say. The French, as I said before, they did not settle permanently in mid-Missouri. There were some forts, temporary forts further up the river, but really the last settlement of French origin is really Côte Saint-Drézin, you may be familiar with, which is French for hill without design. It's because it's a hill near the mouth of the Osage by Jefferson City in Callaway County that stands out alone in the middle of the river valley. And there was, most interestingly, there must have been an indigenous settlement because there's a row of mounds across that hill. But by the historical period, the French had made a small village there, and that was kind of the last village that wasn't a temporary fort up the river. There is an obscure reference in Switzerland that says some people say they saw an abandoned fur trapper's cabin in Boone County when the Americans got here in the 1810s and 20s. So it's impossible to verify. It wouldn't surprise me though. That is to say though that the French left a lot of their most important back in place names, as we discussed, Roach, Perchy, and stuff like that. There was really a change in cultural attitudes when the Kentuckians came, and I use Kentuckians because I think early Boone County and Columbia was something like 60% from Madison County, Kentucky, 60 to 70%, one specific county in Kentucky. And I think it's like 80 to 85% from Kentucky in general. And if you weren't from Kentucky, you were probably from Virginia or Tennessee. These people really identified with the Americans that came through the Cumberland, the version of Daniel Boone leading Kentuckians through the Virginians then through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky, painted by George Caleb Bingham, because George Caleb Bingham really saw that as part of his own heritage, his mid-Missouri people's heritage at that point. George painted, by the way, in a style we call the luminous style, which it was kind of sometimes called the luminous style, which was known for its use of light. And here, you have some fun symbolism with the light of civilization back there and going into the darkness of the wilderness, marching forward. These Kentuckians, of course, brought enslaved people with them. When they came to Boone County later, white Americans and black Americans came into Boone County together, hand in hand at pretty much the same time. You see a lot of tropes here too of that still persist sometimes in Missouri culture today. The hound dog there and the horse. Kentuckians are known for their horses, as is Boone County. So this painting, by the way, hangs in the city hall in the old Daniel Boone Hotel. We have no evidence that Daniel Boone actually came this far west. It's been claimed many times, but there's really no good evidence that happened. His two sons, however, most certainly did, and it was his two sons that discovered the salt lick known as the Boone's Lick out in Howard County, what's today called Howard County. It's possible Daniel Boone hunted out here, but no one's ever proven it. Daniel Boone did live in Marthasville, Missouri, or what is now Marthasville, towards the end of his life. I think it was Defiance back then, right? Yes. Yes, most definitely. So Daniel Boone died the same year Boone County was incorporated, and the Missouri state legislature, being dominated by and large by these Kentuckians, wanted to honor Daniel Boone. And so they thought it appropriate to name a county after him in 1820 that was carried the Boone name, and it also was in the Boone's Lick area. So you see that name repeated in the Boone's Lick area with Booneville. And of course, Daniel Boone spelled it both ways, with the E and without. So Booneville does not use the E. Boone County does use the E in Boone County, which is always fun. I think Daniel Boone almost always spelled it actually Boon. Hunters were not known for their literacy. This painting is another George Caleb Bingham painting entitled "The Squatters." Now, these squatters really came into this area. These are Boone's Lick squatters. They are not wealthy people in general. You don't need to squat for new land if you're a wealthy person already. You can just buy it outright. And these people really came in before the United States government was really comfortable with them being out here. The United States government couldn't protect them from the indigenous threat as they saw it. And legally, everything was still pretty unsettled out here on the frontier, but people came anyway, as early as 1812-ish, and they settled in the area where that Boone's Lick Spring is in Howard County, about where Glasgow is, all the way down through Boone County to about southern Boone County, largely on the north side of the river, a little bit on the south side too. But that's the heart. That's what the Boonslick was back then. And the Boonslick was seen as um, a boom town. I mean, there was tons of excitement about the Boonslick. It was fertile land. It had forest, old growth forest on it. It was unclaimed by other white people. It was a place to make your fortune. And if you could get there first, you know, you could really turn a profit. So these people show up, and immediately the War of 1812 breaks out, which is a complicated geopolitical situation, essentially. But here in mid-Missouri, the ramification was essentially that these squatters had to concentrate in these little forts. And forts might be putting it a little grandiosely. These were like 4 log cabins with walls between them. And there was about a dozen of these forts spread from the north side of Howard County, a little bit west of Booneville, all the way down to about Montauk Creek. The first American settlers in Boone County came at the end of the war in 1816. Once these forts were able to come out of these forts, and they came across the Montauk into a place we call Thrall's Prairie today. So it's interesting, though, the river is still prominent in these Bingham paintings. I think this bluff line here, if you can make that out, is unmistakable to any of us who know what the Missouri River Valley looks like. That's a squatter in the bottomland. So whether George Caleb Bingham was imagining Franklin, Missouri, across from Booneville, or even a specific spot at all, is up to question. But I think undoubtedly in his mind, that's river bottomland there, because you just don't see that kind of hill around here unless you're down in the bottomland. Yeah, this one's called the Jolly Flatboatman. There's actually a couple entitled this, but this one's fun, which really, to me, just kind of shows you the commerce, as Bingham saw, a great depiction of the commerce as it came up the river. You'll see a little fur, maybe a raccoon or something hanging off the boat there. The way these type of boat, the French people were using these flatboats are clearly indicative of American commerce and American settlement. And they lasted a while because they were easier to manage than the big steamboats, which often got caught up on snags and stuff. I think the first steamboat came up to Franklin in 1819, which would have come right along here in Boone County. There's a story Spitzler recounts, who knows if it's real or not, of a farmer down in southern Boone County. They heard the steam whistle of the first steamboat, had no idea what it was, and he ran inside and told his wife to pack up because Gabriel's blowing his horn. The end days are coming. This one is called Shooting for Beef, which I believe implies that they're betting on a shooting game in hopes that they can win a cow or something. I could be wrong about that. Don't quote me. That sign, which is illegible in this painting, says 12 miles to Boonesboro, which is probably a reference to Boonesboro in Howard County, which is now pretty much just an intersection, but named after, of course, the fort in Kentucky where Daniel Boone pulled up. I was amused when I was pulling this image to see that the Brooklyn Museum of Art told me that Boonesboro was in Boone County, Missouri. That's why local knowledge is important. This again has to be the river bottom. To me, you see those gorgeous river bluffs in the background. It's unmistakable to anybody who knows this area. George really made his name with those river paintings and went on to bigger and greater things. But it's fun to use his paintings because we don't have photographs from that time. So visually, they're the best thing we got to even show what the natural environment looked like. Boone County river towns. So now we're well into the period of American settlement. And we could talk a lot about Boone County, Columbia, but I'd like to stay down by the river most and talk about these 5 river towns: Nashville, Rocheport, Stonesport, Claysville, and Providence. I like to differentiate in Boone County between river towns and railroad towns, because some of the towns we think are river towns are actually railroad towns. McBain, for instance, is a railroad town. Hartsburg is actually a railroad town. by and large. These were founded later. But these towns were founded very early, before the train came, because the goods were transported up the river, and you needed a place to unload. Not only unload the goods, but to ship your product back out, which pre-Civil War often was tobacco, hemp, things like that. Nashville is the oldest of these, founded by, he's been called an eccentric genius, Ira Nash. It's about where Cooper's Landing is, probably out in the middle of the river today. But Ira Nash was a cantankerous man, to put it lightly. He quarreled with his neighbors. He was a big personality. He actually he was a wealthy man and owned quite a bit of land. And I believe he settled on a New Madrid claim. And if you haven't heard what New Madrid claims are yet, they were claims of land given to victims of the New Madrid earthquake down the Boot Hill. People who owned land down there were given land as a replacement for their lost land, which was never developed. It wasn't developed at the time, but they owned it. And so a lot of these New Madrid claims were not used by people who wanted to settle on them, but used by land spectators. I mean, we don't often think about it, but capitalism is in full force now in terms of land spectation and making a profit and things like that. So the earliest documented land claims on the Boonlick are largely these New Madrid claims. Yes, Steve.
I've also heard like Nashville was Spanish. There's like
I think you're right. I think Nashville was a Spanish land grant. I think Nashville was a Spanish land grant. I just misremembered that. The Spanish land grant, I don't think there were hardly any of those in this area. For one, the Spanish really ruled Louisiana for, what's now Missouri, for a very short period of time. But I think you're right. And I think Ira Nash managed to swing a Spanish land grant. He may be one of the only ones, if the only one in this area. Interesting side story about Ira Nash is the famous legend that he quarreled so hard with his neighbors that he wanted to be buried looking down upon them. So they placed him in an indigenous burial mound, vertical, looking down at his neighbors that he disliked. So that tells you something of his personality. When Nashville washed away, it was replaced by the Providence River landing. The Nashville washed away in a flood, as did Stonesport on that list too, as did Franklin, Missouri, which of course was the first town in mid-Missouri, about directly across from where Boonville is today. That lesson had to be learned over and over again in mid-Missouri, not to build in the floodplain. And you'll see that inevitably after the big flood that washed away the town, they sought a location which was up on a rocky bluff or a high bluff. Rocheport is in one of these, of course. Rocheport, Rocky Port. There's a limestone. It's described as a limestone ledge. And I've never been able to find an image of this because I think it was long gone by the time photography came around. But I suspect if you were to take a bulldozer or 10 and dig all that dirt out in the front of Rocheport where the gravel is now, you could find the rocky ledge that probably was easy docking for boats. That is the reason Rocheport is there. I want to read you William Switzer's recount of the flood that washed away Nashville because I can't tell it much better than him. And it really shows the river in its how Americans were surprised by these floods that happened way back in the 1800s. So give me 1 second. I'm going to find it here. Switzler titles this The Great Freshet of 1844. If you're familiar with the natural cycle of the river before channelization, before damming, there were generally two rises to the river, one in spring and then one in summer, when the snow on the plains melted, and then another one when the snow on the mountains melted. So this is the summer freshet of 1844. Switzler says no event, perhaps, in the history of Boone County is more marked than the June freshet in the Missouri River in 1844. At no time before or since was the river ever so full. Completely without its banks in the lowlands along the whole course of the river were overflown. The town of Rocheport in Boone County suffered very seriously. The store and warehouse of Pebbles and Kaisers near the bank were inundated, and the lower floors being covered with several feet of water. Water 6 feet deep upon the floor of the dining room of Norcut's Hotel and above the counters in all the business houses fronting the river. The steamboat Wapello went as far into town as the market house, with which it collided, demolishing the house. All the merchants in the place removed their goods to more elevated positions on Central Street. The town of Nashville, Providence was then unknown, was completely inundated, and also the immense bottoms adjacent. Every inhabitant of Nashville had to desert it. The water was 8 feet deep in the streets. Rice G. Woods and Company and John Parker and Sons, merchants, in order to save their goods, shipped them on the steamboats, the later to St. Louis and the former to Teeter's Landing, up the river. Lamb's warehouse was swept away, and Camplin's tobacco factory, which stood on the riverbank, caved into the river. Great destruction of property and personal distress and perils to life and limb were occasioned in the Missouri bottom. A number of families were rendered destitute, and relief was afforded to them by wagon loads of provisions, which more fortunate citizens contributed. On Tuesday night, June 18th, about 9 o'clock, 4 citizens of Columbia left that place for Nashville for the purpose of aiding Woods and Company to prepare their goods for shipment on a steamer in order to save them. North of town, there was a slough, and also the lowlands adjacent, which without their knowledge and contrary to their expectations were underwater. Arriving about 3 o'clock in the morning at the edge of the water and about 1 mile from the village, and not for a moment suspecting the water was too deep to be thus encountered, they rode into it on their horses, one of them with a lantern leading the way. They soon discovered their danger, and in the pitchy darkness of the night became confused, lost their way, and resolved to tie their horses, abandon them, and climb trees, and remain till morning. Fortunately, the beleaguered quattro reached the 2 saplings not far distant, and 2 ascended each of them. And there, amid the howling of the night and the terrible roar of the remorseless flood, they remained perched till morning. By the time the waters had so risen that their horses could not stand, therefore determined to make another effort to escape the great and singular perils which threatened them and to reach the town, they descended from the limbs on which they had stood for the whole night, mounted their horses, and headed their course for dry land about 1,000 yards distant. After accomplishing 3/4 of the way, their horses gave out, and a watery grave seemed to be the fate of all. 2 of the men succeeded in reaching trees, a third a large floating log, but the fourth, Mr. Collier, benumbed by the vapors of the night and flood, and overcome by the dangers through which they had passed, and which seemed still to block their way to safety, lost all self-control and was drowned. About 6 o'clock in the morning, 3 who remained gave an alarm at a loud cries of distress, were relieved by Dr. William B. Lenore, Harry Acton, and other citizens, who made their way to them on a hastily constructed raft of planks and logs. Mr. Collier's body would say that the town of Nashville was at once a new town at a place of business for the country road about as a shipping and receiving point for Columbia, and therefore, before the flood had fairly subsided, the commissioners of Providence advertised a sale of lots at a point immediately above the Nashville bottom on a permanent rock bluff, and a sale of lots was made on July 13th. That story could be repeated in the Missouri River bottoms time and time again in the 1800s. Booneville, of course, and New Franklin were founded after Franklin washed away and people fled to the bluffs, the high bluffs on either side, to make more permanent residence. So you see the dates there. Nashville, about 1819, whereas Providence is about the 1840s, because Columbia needed a shipping point. There were no railroads at this point. Columbia needed access to the river. Stonesport is truly a lost town. Stonesport is probably in a cornfield a little bit north of Hartsburg today, the site of it at least. Stonesport is really the forerunner of Claysville. You see there the same pattern. Stonesport about 1820, Claysville 1844. The Rocheportians, in all their wisdom, founded their town well from the get-go and did not have this problem. So the advantage of the limestone ledge in Rocheport. Here is an old image of Providence, Missouri, when one of the warehouses was still standing. There's still some ruins down there to this day. This is basically what you know as the Providence access on Perchy Creek. At the time, though, that was right on the Missouri River. The land that has since been placed there, Perchy Creek's mouth is much farther south on the river than it once was. And of course, the Roche Perchy archway is even farther north than that. So you can trace the development and the placement of fill by the river from the Roche Perchy Natural Arts to Providence to the present day mouth of the Perchy Creek, really showing you that dynamic river, laying more land. And people took advantage of this fast. That was new land. That was free land. You could farm it. You could put cows on it. You could do a lot with it. Sometimes. So you couldn't. There's a plat of Providence from, I think, the 1875 Atlas of Boone County there on bottom, which you can compare to the much newer railroad town of Sturgeon above, which is kind of a fun exercise. Railroads came to Boone County right after the Civil War. The first railroad in Boone County was not the railroad that ran on the Katy Trail down here. That was much later. That came in the 1890s. The first railroad in Boone County, and pretty much the first significant railroad in Missouri, was that of the North Missouri that went from St. Louis on the north side of the river, and then about Centralia and Sturgeon turned north and went and headed north. That North Missouri Railroad came in, was planned in the 1850s, and it delayed by the Civil War. You couldn't build a railroad then. Well, the railroad was there in the Civil War, but all further progress stopped on it, and then it was completed by the 1870s. And that line to Columbia that we now know as the Colt or the Wabash line, the Wabash Station, was the only railroad to Columbia for 30-ish years until the spur from the MKT was built up from the river. I pointed the contrast of these two because Sturgeon, like so many railroad towns, was developed very quickly. Moberly is a great example of a railroad town. It got its nickname that way, the Magic City. They called it Magic because it was like magic how fast it sprang up overnight. Sturgeon is named after actually the commissioner of the North Missouri Railroad. They didn't know where that railroad was going to turn north. And so the enterprising folks of Sturgeon thought, let's name it after the railroad commissioner. He'll make sure the railroad runs through this town. And sure enough, it ran through that town and then immediately went north. So that happened. The Providence Plank Road, Providence Road in Columbia, of course, is famously named after Providence, the town, because that's where it went originally. Old Plank Road is really nearer to the original alignment of the Providence Plank Road. This is an image in the Howard Municipal Building, the old City Hall. Now it's the City Courts. It's one of several murals that shows of the Plank Road. Plank roads were all the rage, as you may have heard. In the mid 1800s, they saw it as a way to be done with the mud and the ruts and the awful conditions. Little did they know, wood rots, and pretty quick when you're running horses and manure and traffic over it, and it would take a lot of money to maintain that kind of road over miles, and pretty much no plank road succeeded for very long. Pretty soon, it was just a dirt road again. But you can see this plank road still. As you drive down to Providence Landing, you can see the cuts through that loess we were talking about earlier. You can see the thickness of the loess deposits on the bluffs as you go down to Providence Road. A great indicator, it's not surefire, but a great indicator of the age of a road in Boone County is how deep is the cut that it's in. Because as wagons or later cars went along these roads, they would basically dig a big deep cut into the ground. And some of the best examples of these, because there's such erosive soils, are in the river hills as you get down to the bottom in Boone County. I like this too because it with the artistic eye, he was showing different modes of transportation with the steamboat and the Providence Landing, and then the wagon or buggy down to the bottom. Providence is said to be named because of the providence of God that guided them to the location. Of course, this would have been after the disaster of the Nashville flood, where they were probably looking for some providence to lead them to a safer place to go. So that's the origin of that name. That's the origin of the road Providence, and the etymology continues on to the Providence Bowl to this day. Are we still doing that, Columbia? The Providence Bowl used to be the name of the game between Hickman and Rockbridge back in the day. So we're jumping quite a bit farther ahead in history now, but I want to touch on some interesting sites. This is Mount Celestial Church in near McBain. This is interesting to me because it is a rural African-American church. We have several of these in Boone County. They're not very well known, but in association with it is an absolutely massive cemetery. Absolutely huge, hundreds and hundreds of burials. And it's quite old. And this church still exists in Columbia. I think it's quite small. And this building no longer stands, but it shows sort of who was allowed to use what land back in the day. By the time the Civil War ended, it was seen and acknowledged that the river bottoms were quite fertile. And so those were spoken for. But this interface between the more fertile plains and the fertile river bottoms, the rocky bluffs and kind of the rocky soil, that was the land that freed enslaved people got. That's where they were given churches to found, and that's maybe where they had been burying their ancestors since before the Civil War. Another one of these is Log Providence Church in around Three Creeks in Boone County. Log Providence was at the back of the Bass plantation. Bass was the richest man in Boone County, and that was the worst, most rugged land. You have a similar situation here where the enslaved people that were working the river bottoms around McBain after the Civil War, their community center and their place was this Mount Celestial Church. So it's just very interesting to me. How are we doing on time here, Steve? I think it's whatever. Okay. I did bring some artifacts with me today, just a few books from my library. I kind of got into Columbia history originally by thinking I was going to collect every book about Columbia and Boone County that existed. I think I was 18. I thought, well, there must be 15 or 12 books, you know. I was so naive. I think I'm up to 170, 180 now, and there's 100 more on my list at least. So, but occasionally I run across other cool things, and I have this physical copy with me today, and I'll spread it out on a table afterwards. This is an original Missouri River Commission map from 1899. It's a very detailed survey of the Missouri River from Huntsdale on the left to Rocheport there, or Huntsdale on the right to Rocheport on the left. So we're on this map. Our spot is on this map. But the amazing thing to me is how detailed they've charted the islands and the land uses, the agricultural land uses of I didn't really want to spend a lot of time today talking about the channelization of the river because I think this crowd is very well versed in that history. But I did want to briefly mention this as part of that as we go through chronologically here. This is an old image of Rocheport, one of the oldest I've seen, taken from essentially on top of the hill that the train tunnels through, basically right above Montauk Creek, looking towards downtown Rocheport, towards, Les Bourgeois is kind of up here on this way. So you can see before it was filled how close the river was to downtown. And I always wonder, if we had higher resolution, could we see any of that original rocky port, that rock bluff that's there? Yeah. The railroad comes in along here and would be along here, and then the bluff was bored in. It might actually be a little farther in. It might come down right there. It's hard to tell, but that's essentially it. We talk about how drastically the land changed when the river was channelized, but I don't think we often mention how drastically the bluff changed when the railroad came through. There were pictographs all over this hill next to Rocheport, reportedly, and those were blasted away by the train tunnel that was bored through the tunnel. But that's not the only bluff that was changed like that. All of the bluffs along Boone County generally were sharpened and made more steep because they were cut by the railroad, so the railroad could have a nice level surface, unimpeded with enough room between the river and the bluff to operate. That's why if you've been down the Katy Trail and you've seen that little dynamite depot, that's the scary looking rock house there. That's the dynamite. That's what the dynamite's for, to blast away the rock. Um, it's I always we don't, photography and the railroads came around the same time, so we don't have images of what the bluffs necessarily look like in their natural states. Some of them clearly are pretty close. You can see the weathering to this day. Some of them, you look at them and you say, that really has been altered by human impact. I think that tall building, I've speculated it's a hotel before, because a big tall one like that often is, but it could also be something agricultural industry related, a hemp. It could be a hemp factory. Usually hemp factories had big openings for like the drying of the hemp and stuff. That one looks maybe brick to me. It's hard to tell. Jumping again very fast, I wanted to show this image. This is the ribbon cutting on the old Rocheport Bridge back in the day. RIP. The problem with the river and Columbia was always too, how do you get across the river? Ferries were okay, but by and large, when motor cars came along, it was Highway 40, the same alignment that you take today through Midway and then across the river at Boonville. There was no crossing in Boone County until this bridge, until the Rocheport Bridge. I think this is amazing because I think this was probably taken shortly after it opened, and the lack of traffic is just astounding. This also shows the biggest land use change around here in my lifetime, besides maybe the urbanization of Columbia, which is, of course, the Overton Bottoms here right across the way, which in my childhood memory were all corn and soybeans, and now are glorious wetlands and floodplain. This was in MoDOT's reel. This seems to be downtown Rocheport, and this man has injured himself during the opening ceremonies of the bridge and is being cared for by a nurse. A bon femme, indeed. But before I take questions, I want to do a real quick. We just took this display down at the Boone County History and Culture Center. We did a retrospective because last year was the 30th anniversary of the flood of '93. And I wanted to show you what it looked like and kind of some of our artifacts from that. We had a giant wall timeline that showed the river level over the 3 months, along with Columbia Daily Tribune articles along the way. Notating everything from the first death, the McBain man drowning, trying to get to his house, all the way to Ross Perot visiting Rocheport, which was a front page item. And we have a boat that was used, not this boat, there was another boat that was actually used in the flood of '93 in relief. These are, I don't know why this little thing is about, but these Anheuser-Busch, some of you may remember, made drinking water. They switched from beer to drinking water in St. Louis. So those are Budweiser drinking water cans. Here is a Shelter Insurance Flood of '93 crew shirt that clearly hasn't been cleaned for 30 years because it still had river mud all over it. And then some of the sandbagging at Rocheport. So when we presented this this retrospective, it really wasn't solely from the perspective of the flood is all bad and that the flood is damaging. We really tried to bookend this timeline with the scientific knowledge that floods are natural, that flooding of the floodplain is natural, and the benefits, the ecological benefits afterwards that occurred as well from the flood. So certainly that flood of '93, in my local historian's opinion, top 3 events in Boone County history of all time. That's a big deal. So that's my bird's eye view of Boone County history. Thank you for listening. If you got questions. Not yet. No. Matt. Check. Yeah. Hey.
Sing. Okay.
Yeah, Matt, thanks very much for that talk. It's really very, very interesting. So there are remnants of mounds on all these bluffs around here. Were they all burials or were some of them ceremonial without being burials?
In my amateur archaeological opinion, it seems like they were probably all burial mounds. Now, whether or not we can determine that, whether or not there are remains, Boone County soil is not kind to human remains. And I want to add an aside since we're talking about these mounds. Um, Missouri has a problem with looters in these mounds, and it's really, really dumb. There's nothing of value in these mounds that you're going to be able to sell on the market. The only thing you're destroying is good archaeological information. So I want to make that aside real quick while we're talking about mounds. But yeah, I think we can be conservative about that too and say that we don't know much for sure. We've constructed this now, and the dialogue between scientists and indigenous peoples has really only opened up in a more open fashion in the last few decades. So I think we're still learning a lot. But my understanding is pretty much every mound in Boone County is a burial mound of some kind. Now, burial can include ceremony. So
I have come across one, and who knows, like if it's been disturbed, changed, whatever, but is actually like a circle on a river bluff where three ridges come together, and there's kind of holes in that circle, but that didn't seem to be a burial mound, and it's hard to know like who made that, when that was made. Like I have no idea.
yeah, I would agree that form is known to not be generally a burial mound. That's known to be ceremonial. I'm not actually aware of anything like that in Boone County, so
I'm not telling you about it.
I'd love to hear more.
I don't see any hands. I have a question. So, right near Huntsdale, where Terrapin Creek comes in on some of the old maps, is a place called Circe's Landing.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard anything about who that person might be?
Circe is a surname. There's several Circes in later Columbia history, after river history, that I wonder if are related. I don't know anything about that Circe. But of course, there were a lot of these landings, named after usually the landowner or the merchant operating a thing there. And that's one of those. Terrapin Neck is a cool, that neighborhood is a cool, when Switzler says Terrapin Neck, he describes it as the strip of river of land between Rocheport down to Huntsdale. But then you get later histories that describe Terrapin Neck as very much just that neighborhood right there around Huntsdale. So again, this could be a indication that there was more land once there that has now gone away or something like that. But I don't know much about the.
Yeah, it's super interesting. That little piece of land right by Terrapin Creek, right by the Katy Trail, is way higher than everything else. And I think that's kind of where that Circe's Landing was. But anyway,
yeah,
we're searching to find more about Circe. Oh, there's surely other questions. Yes, of course.
Many of the families you talked about came from Kentucky, but a lot of the old families came from Virginia to Kentucky to Boone County, as my family did. So it just wasn't a Kentucky thing. It's many people went from Virginia to Kentucky, then to Boone County within the same fans.
And some of them, you're right, some of them totally saw themselves, they lived so briefly in Kentucky, they only saw themselves as Virginians, by the time they got here. I think there's an old ballad of Boonlick that says Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, blooded of three, or something like that, that describes that original old stock. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
All right. Coming at you, man. Oh, it's a race.
You talking about Terrapin Creek and all that right there. When you're going, I can't remember if it's just this side of Terrapin where you cross over on the Katy Trail or just the other side, and it's on private property, so I didn't inspect, but there's like a pit there It's pretty large and you can't see it on Google Maps or anything, so don't really have any idea what it is, but it is right in that Terrapin Creek neighborhood thing.
I don't know about that specific one, but one thing I've noticed from walking the trail a lot and observing river bluffs is that the river bluff was a really easy place to mine things, to resources, whether that be clay or the rock wool that the Easley mine was famous for mining, or even just a quarry. And I think that's just the elevation difference makes it easy to get in the side. You didn't have to dig down. It's easy in the side of the hill. And that could be a case of that. There's like another place name in Boone County. I wonder if anybody here knows, called Soft Pit Road, way down in the south, and it's right on the river line. I always wonder, where's the soft pit? What is that about? That doesn't sound like a surname. So what's going on there? So it could be something like that. That's my guess.
That makes sense because it does kind of open up into, looks like a little bit of a cave, but there's obviously been some sort of digging and stuff done around there. It's kind of interesting.
There's just been so much human busyness at this interface of river and land and bluff. Industry and intrigue, and just so much has happened on this thin line. It's a very for all the great natural communities that might still be intact on the bluff, it's a very disturbed area. And we should remember that pretty much 100% of Boone County was deforested. There is no old growth forest in this county. If you look at pictures from the 30s, it looks like the Kansas prairies there until the conservation movement of the 1930s and reforestation. For a while, I think the scientists thought maybe Schnabel Woods down here on the bluff was a remnant of an old growth, but then they did some science and said, no, that one was logged too. So if there is an old growth forest in Boone County, it may be on the part of the bluff, the slope that was unloggable and rocky. But even then, I think old growth trees were so valuable, and if you put yourself in the shoes of a farmer in the Depression or something like that, generally every place in Boone County has been touched in the last 200 years.
All right. Okay, I got him.
I'll talk about it.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you. I wondered if you could, my mind's spinning with a couple different thoughts here. I wondered if you might be able to speak about, I've heard vaguely that after Lewis and Clark days, there was a time where William Clark maybe relocated some Sac and Fox Indians to the Rocheport area. I didn't know if that had ever come up in your research or anything.
I can't recall the moment exactly, but he was, of course, famously in charge of such things. And we did have Saxon Fox Indians in the area. I think now by Rocheport area, I think they were given a much larger probably area to roam about. I'd have to look at the exact treaties and what they had, but generally they're described as coming down from kind of northeastern and northern Missouri into this area, or raiding into this area. When the attack on the Missouri Village is described, which is up in Saline County, they came on the warpath from the north to attack that village. That said, someone was maintaining those pictographs by Rocheport with red ochre, because rainwater would wash those away over time. And I've read several opinions that say that maybe that indigenous presence of people who were pushed here were still maintained. We're recognizing the significance of these sites as fellow indigenous people and maintaining them. So, did you have another thing? You had several ideas, you said.
I can't stop. I live in Rocheport. I love this area. Since everybody's trapped here, I just thought I wanted to mention that we just did a 100-year time capsule and for Rocheport, and I was excited to put a bunch of river relief history and facts and kind of updates on river relief in this 100-year time capsule. And it might interest everybody to know about Rocheport, I guess. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I had heard that Rocheport was considered for the state capital at one time. It was considered for the site of the University of Missouri.
Yeah.
So quite a little history there.
I think Rocheport, the one that's really famous as a consideration for the capital was that Stonesport that was washed away. That site, I know we have documented records, but if memory serves right, when they, decided where the state capital needed to be. It needed to be within 50 miles or so of the mouth of the Osage, 40 miles of the mouth of the Osage. So that would certainly put Rocheport in the contention there. And Rocheport was 1819, which predates this decision-making process, by a couple of years. So, I'm sure it was brought up in conversation because every person in their town was a booster for them. Most people were boosters for their town back then and advocates for their town.
Yeah, I heard that they're going to move the Arabia to Rocheport as well.
I've never heard of Rocheport being a serious contender for the state university because I think it was assumed that the state university would be in one of the county seats of these five. The rule was one of these 5 central counties it had to be located in. And by that point, Columbia had, claimed the county seat. Fayette had claimed the county seat. And so these were the logical establishments and the people that were elected, like James Rollins, who made it possible. What essentially made the state university possible in Columbia was Rollins' giant donation of land last minute, in addition to his tireless advocacy. So that's to my knowledge.
All right.
I will, I have books from my personal collection back there. If you want to talk river history, they're all relevant to Missouri River history. And I'm going to spread out that Missouri River Commission map from 1899 because I just think it's too cool to waste on myself. So thank you. One more.
How do people find out when you have exhibits at the Historic Society?
Yeah, boonhistory.org. We're really, really excited. This is our 100th anniversary, 2024. So we're going to do our coolest 100 objects, which include Blind Boone's gold watch, which tells the time and barometric pressure by a complicated series of whistles, Odin Guitar's sword, Blind Boone's piano, all sorts of things, Corla Pandit's turban. Come see it at the Boone County Historical Society this year. You can find it at boonhistory.org. I also have cards if you'd like to contact us back on the table back there.
That is awesome, Matt. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.